So these are the traditional elements of storytelling. How do we use these traditional elements in a kind of a contemporary age? So the first one is character. I think the first thing to think about is like who's involved, and we've tried to mostly use examples that aren't ours so as not to seem hubristic, but we can talk about that. But so I think everyone knows about Burger King's campaign. And so the traditional way of going about this would be to say like, oh, like our characters are these characters in the TV spot. What if we have this great idea where we use the king, who's part of your brand assets, and blah, 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 blah. He's part of your heritage. Client, you love to hear that. And we create whole stories around him and what it would be like if he existed in real life. Like, that's interesting. Those are fictional characters you create. Advertising has actually been doing that for a long time. But what if you start to take him out of that fictitious environment and put him into the real world? What if you start to have that character interact with real characters? So like when they had the king kind of sort of fake date, what was the model's name? Burke. Yes, and like go get his dry cleaning done with her, go to real basketball games with her. So what if you now start to think of other characters that sort of blur the lines between like the world your character lives in and these characters live in? What if you start to involve other people in the story and pass out masks where everyone can become the character, right? So again, here you are kind of involving real people, and I think it's interesting. I think lots of times people think about how can we get real people to participate in this, which is sort of like how can we get them to do stuff we want them to do, but it's actually like, well, how would you think about getting real people to be characters in this story? What's the role for them in this story? Is like the role for them in this story is that by donning this mask, they're allowed to do things they weren't allowed to do usually in their life. And the last thing, so you have like kind of characters we create, you have real characters that exist in the world, you have actual people. And then I really like the idea, which is a little weird, of obviously you guys have heard of Whopper Sacrifice. But what I like about this idea is that it actually uses kind of third-party entities who don't even know they're part of the story as characters. So Whopper Sacrifice basically violently brings other people into the story of Burger King, right? Like they didn't know that they were doing. I think we're going to show you a case study at the end, which also kind of like violently brings like institutions into the story. So like I think what you should think about, like who are the characters in your story? It's sort of boring to think about just the characters in the story being characters you create. Where are other characters you can find? And the thing to do there is to take as much care with those characters as like F. Scott Fitzgerald did with everyone in The Great Gatsby. So you should think about who are they? What are they like? What are their motivations? What do they want to get out of the story? Why are they in the story in the first place? I think that kind of creates greater participation and makes it harder for them to opt out. Like with Whopper Sacrifice, there was totally a thing where you could have been like, oh, I have an idea. Like let's give people the ability to give everyone in their Facebook network a free coupon for a Whopper. Like that doesn't really care about who those other people as characters are. But when you say like, let's commit a violent social act against them, then you suddenly understand their motivations. Suddenly they're drawn to the story because they feel hurt, they're intrigued, but you start to think about them as people who actually have motivations. So I would think the first thing you should think about are who are the characters in your story, and how can you have more non-traditional characters in your story? Not just by like getting them to participate, but giving them a hook into the story, a reason they want to be part of that story.